Picture this. It's a Friday night in April. The Civil War is finally over. The city is celebrating. Music is playing in the streets. People are laughing. There's this collective exhale across a nation that has been bleeding for 4 years, and you decide to go to the theater. That's exactly what thousands of people in Washington, D.C. were thinking on April 14th, 1865. Just a regular Friday night out. Go see a comedy, have a few laughs, maybe catch a glimpse of the president. But a handful of people in that theater that night would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe what they saw, what they heard, what they smelled, what it felt like to watch history shatter in front of them in the span of a single second. Today, we're going to hear from those people directly. Not the history book version, not the sanitized marble statue version, the raw first-hand accounts, the ones that were written down in shaking handwriting hours after it happened, or spoken into a reporter's notebook years later when the witnesses were old and still couldn't sleep through the night without seeing it again. So, if you've ever wanted to actually be in Ford's Theater on the night of April 14th, 1865, this is about as close as you're going to get. Let's go back. Before we even get to the theater, you need to understand the mood of Washington, D.C. that week, because it wasn't just any week. It was arguably the most euphoric week the city had ever experienced. General Robert E. Lee had surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse just 5 days earlier, on April 9th. 5 days. The wounds of the war were still fresh, literally and figuratively. But for the first time in years, people actually believed it might be over. Really over. The streets of Washington were electric. Cannons were fired in celebration. Buildings were draped in flags. People who had barely smiled in 4 years were suddenly grinning at strangers. Henry Rathbone, who would become one of the key witnesses to the assassination, later described the atmosphere of that week as something almost surreal. The joy felt almost too big, he said. Like the city didn't quite know what to do with it. And Abraham Lincoln himself was feeling it. People close to him noted that he seemed lighter that week, less burdened. One of his secretaries wrote that the president looked like a man who had just set down a weight he'd been carrying for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. Lincoln had actually had a vivid dream earlier that week, one he mentioned to his cabinet. In the dream, he was on a ship moving rapidly toward a dark and indefinite shore. He told them he'd had this dream before great events, before battles, before victories. He didn't know what it meant this time, but he mentioned it. That detail matters. Hold on to it. Now, the evening of April 14th. Lincoln had initially been reluctant to go out that night. He was tired. He had a full schedule. Mary Todd Lincoln wasn't feeling particularly well either, but the theater had advertised that the president would be attending, and Lincoln felt an obligation not to disappoint the crowd. The play was Our American Cousin, a popular British comedy. Not exactly high art, but it was funny. It was light, and after 4 years of war, funny and light was exactly what people wanted. The theater manager, Henry Clay Ford, was thrilled to have the president in attendance. The presidential box, Box 7, actually a combination of boxes 7 and 8 with the partition removed, was decorated with flags and bunting. A special rocking chair had been brought in for Lincoln, who famously found regular theater chairs uncomfortable. That rocking chair. Remember that detail too. Ford's Theater on 10th Street was a beautiful building. Rebuilt just 2 years earlier after a fire destroyed the original structure, it had a capacity of around 1,700 people. By the time the evening performance began, it was packed. James P. Ferguson was a restaurant owner whose establishment was next door to the theater. He had managed to get himself a seat specifically because he wanted to see General Grant, who had been originally announced as attending with the Lincolns that evening. Grant ultimately canceled. His wife Julia was uncomfortable around Mary Todd Lincoln, which is a whole separate story. But Ferguson came anyway. He sat in the dress circle, which gave him a relatively good view of the presidential box. Ferguson would later become one of the most detailed eyewitnesses, and his account is striking for how normal everything seemed before it happened. He described the president arriving around 8:30 p.m., late enough that the play had already started. When Lincoln appeared at the railing of the box to acknowledge the crowd, the audience stood and cheered. The orchestra played "Hail to the Chief." Lincoln smiled and bowed. Ferguson wrote that Lincoln seemed genuinely pleased to be there. He sat down in that rocking chair, and the play resumed, and everything was just an evening at the theater. People laughed at the jokes. Lincoln laughed too. Witnesses in nearby seats could hear him. Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris, the daughter of a senator, had been the last-minute substitutes when Grant cancelled. They sat in the box with the Lincolns. Rathbone later wrote that the mood in the box was pleasant and relaxed. Mary Todd Lincoln was holding the president's hand at some point during the performance. Lincoln apparently leaned over at one point and whispered to her that he didn't care what people thought. He planned to hold her hand if he wanted to. That's a real detail. From a witness. And it's the kind of detail that makes what comes next almost unbearable. Because somewhere in that same building, John Wilkes Booth was moving through the crowd. John Wilkes Booth was not a stranger to Ford's Theater. He was one of the most famous actors in America, a member of the legendary Booth acting family, and he performed there regularly. The staff knew him. The stagehands knew him. Nobody thought twice about seeing him in the building. This is something that witnesses later found deeply troubling when they thought back on it. Booth was hiding in plain sight, and nobody flagged it because there was nothing to flag. He belonged there, or at least he looked like he did. John Buckingham was the ticket taker at the front door that evening. He remembered Booth arriving at the theater around 9 o'clock, roughly an hour before the shooting. Buckingham knew Booth personally and greeted him. Booth, he said, seemed in good spirits. Normal. He said something casual, maybe a joke. Buckingham couldn't remember the exact words later, and went inside. Booth had been in the theater earlier that day as well, receiving his mail. He knew the layout. He knew where the presidential box was. He knew there was a small corridor that led to it, and he knew that the door to that corridor could be secured from the inside. At some point during the day, he had carved a small notch in the wall near the door so he could wedge it shut with a wooden bar after he entered. Nobody noticed him doing this. William Kent, an attendee at the theater that night, later recalled seeing a man fitting Booth's description lingering near the dress circle stairway around 9:30 p.m. At the time, Kent didn't think anything of it. A well-dressed man standing near the stairs, watching the play. Nothing unusual. Looking back, Kent said it made him feel sick, that he had essentially seen Booth casing the corridor approach and thought nothing of it. This is something that comes up again and again in witness accounts from that night. The normalcy of it. The way everything looked completely ordinary, right up until the moment it didn't. The one guard who had been posted outside the presidential box that evening was a man named John Parker, a police officer who, by most accounts, was not particularly diligent in his duties that night. At some point during the performance, Parker left his post. Why exactly has been debated by historians ever since. Some accounts suggest he went to watch the play from a better vantage point. Others suggest he left the building entirely to get a drink at a neighboring saloon. What is not in dispute is that when Booth approached the door to the corridor leading to the presidential box, there was nobody guarding it. Okay, this is the part everyone knows is coming. And yet it's still worth slowing down for, because the witness accounts from this moment are extraordinary. The time was approximately 10:15 p.m. The play was in its third act. There was a scene in progress that contained a particularly funny line, a line that never failed to get a big laugh from the audience. Booth knew the play. He timed his approach for that line, knowing the laughter would cover the sound of him entering the corridor and securing the door. The line was delivered. The audience laughed. It was a good, full, genuine laugh, the kind that fills a theater. And in that moment, John Wilkes Booth entered the corridor, wedged the door shut behind him, and approached the presidential box. What happened inside the box in the next few seconds is known largely through Henry Rathbone's account, since he was the only other adult male present, and he survived. Rathbone described hearing the door open and seeing a man he didn't immediately recognize step into the box. Before he could fully register what was happening or react, Booth raised a small single-shot Derringer pistol and fired. The shot hit Lincoln in the back of the head, behind his left ear. Rathbone lunged at Booth. Booth dropped the pistol and drew a knife, slashing Rathbone deeply across the left arm, a wound that went nearly to the bone. Rathbone grabbed at him anyway, but Booth broke free, vaulted over the railing of the box, and dropped to the stage. The fall was roughly 11 or 12 feet. Booth's spur caught in the bunting decorating the box on the way down, and he landed awkwardly, fracturing a small bone in his left leg. He stood up, turned to the audience. And this is where witness accounts become almost impossible to reconcile with each other, because what people heard and saw in the next few seconds varied enormously, depending on where they were sitting. This is one of the most fascinating and disorienting aspects of the eyewitness record from that night. The reaction of the audience in the immediate aftermath was not what you might expect. There was no immediate mass panic. For a startling number of people in the theater, the first response was confusion. A shot had been fired, yes, but gunshots were not necessarily alarming to people who lived in a city that had been a military headquarters during 4 years of civil war. Some people thought it was part of the play. Laura Keene, the lead actress in Our American Cousin, was on stage when the shot was fired. She later said that her first instinct was that something had gone wrong with a prop, a stagehand mishap. She looked toward the presidential box and saw commotion, and even then it took her a moment to understand what she was seeing. William Withers, Jr., the orchestra conductor that night, was standing in the orchestra pit. He described the shot as surprisingly quiet, a small pistol in a large space full of people, not the dramatic bang you might imagine, more like a sharp crack. And then Booth came over the railing and landed on the stage nearly on top of him. Withers said Booth looked at him for a split second before running, and then Booth shouted something. What he shouted is another point of genuine disagreement in the historical record. Multiple witnesses heard something, but they didn't all hear the same thing. Some witnesses reported hearing sic semper tyrannis, the Virginia state motto, meaning thus always to tyrants. Several accounts say this was shouted either in the box immediately after the shot, on the stage after landing, or both. James Ferguson, from his position in the dress circle, said he heard words shouted but couldn't make them out clearly. Another witness, Dr. Charles Sabin Taft, who was sitting in the front orchestra section, said he heard shouting, but the sound was swallowed by the growing noise of the crowd beginning to understand what had happened. Joseph Stewart was sitting in the front row of the orchestra section. He was one of the first audience members to actually try to stop Booth. The moment he saw a man with a knife running across the stage, Stewart got out of his seat and went after him. He was close, remarkably close. But Booth reached the stage door that led to the alley and got through it before Stewart could catch him. Stewart later said that he came within about 10 feet of Booth as he ran. 10 feet. He could see his face clearly. And Booth looked, Stewart said, not panicked, determined, like a man executing a plan. That detail haunted Stewart for years afterward. Now the confusion broke. Now people understood. The screams started. Not all at once. It spread through the theater like a wave, as the realization moved from row to row, from the orchestra to the dress circle to the upper gallery. Mary Todd Lincoln's scream was described by multiple witnesses as something they never forgot. Clara Harris screamed too. Henry Rathbone, bleeding badly from his arm wound, was shouting that there was a man in the box, that they needed to stop him. But by that point, Booth was already out the stage door and mounting a horse in the alley, helped by an accomplice named Edmund Spangler, though the full extent of Spangler's involvement has been debated by historians ever since. Inside the theater, chaos. Dr. Charles Sabin Taft was, as mentioned, in the front orchestra section. He was a young army surgeon, and the moment he understood what had happened, he pushed through the crowd and somehow managed to climb up into the presidential box. He was one of the first medical professionals to reach Lincoln. What he found was devastating. Lincoln was unconscious. Slumped in the rocking chair, his breathing was labored and irregular. Taft immediately understood that the wound was almost certainly fatal. A shot to the back of the head at close range from a pistol. In 1865, with the medical technology available, there was essentially nothing to be done. But you don't just say that. You don't just stand there and say nothing can be done while the President of the United States is dying in front of you. Another doctor, Charles Leal, had also rushed to the box almost simultaneously. Leal was a 23-year-old army surgeon, barely out of medical school, and he would later write one of the most detailed accounts of Lincoln's final hours. He found Lincoln totally unresponsive, and after a quick examination, located the entry wound. He noted that the ball had entered behind the left ear and had penetrated deeply into the brain. Leal knew immediately that Lincoln would not survive. He wrote later that his first clear thought after examining the wound was, "He is going to die, and my only task now is to make sure that he does not die here on this floor." That practical clarity in the face of something so enormous. That is the voice of a young doctor in shock, doing the only thing he knew how to do. Laura Keene, still on stage when all of this was unfolding, made her way up to the box as well. She asked to hold Lincoln's head in her lap, and she did. There's a famous description, written by witnesses who were present in the box, of her holding the president's head, his blood staining her dress as the theater around them descended into noise and panic. That image, a stage actress still in her costume, holding the dying president while the audience screamed below. The decision was made that Lincoln needed to be moved out of the theater. The idea of carrying him all the way back to the White House, several blocks away, seemed inadvisable given his condition. The decision was made to take him to the nearest available private room. That turned out to be a boarding house directly across the street from the theater, owned by a man named William Petersen. A young soldier named Henry Safford was standing in the doorway of the Petersen House when he saw the commotion across the street, and he called out that they should bring the president there. The men carrying Lincoln, soldiers, doctors, bystanders who had rushed in to help, carried him across 10th Street and into the Petersen House. There's an account from a witness on the street who described watching this small procession in the April night air, and the silence that fell over the crowd that had gathered outside the theater when they understood what they were seeing. People took off their hats. Some people were crying. One witness described a man, a stranger, no one she knew, who was simply standing on the sidewalk with his hands pressed over his face, not moving. Lincoln was carried into a back bedroom on the first floor of the Petersen House. The bed in the room was too short for him. Lincoln was 6'4", so he was laid diagonally across it, and there he would remain through the night. The next several hours are documented in remarkable detail, because the people who gathered at the Petersen House included some of the most powerful figures in American government, and many of them later wrote about what they witnessed. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton arrived and essentially took command of the situation. He set up operations in an adjacent room, coordinating the investigation into the assassination and the search for Booth and his accomplices. Witnesses describe him as remarkably focused, controlled, purposeful, issuing orders, while clearly devastated. Secretary of State William Seward was not present because he had been attacked in his own home that same night as part of the larger conspiracy. Booth had not acted alone. Lewis Powell had broken into the Seward home and stabbed the Secretary of State multiple times. Seward survived, but the fact that there had been coordinated attacks that night on Lincoln, on Seward, and allegedly on Vice President Andrew Johnson as well, though that particular attack never materialized, underscored the scope of what was happening. Washington was under attack. That was the fear rippling through the Petersen House that night. Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy, left a remarkable written account of that night at the Petersen House. He described arriving to find Lincoln laid across the bed, unconscious, surrounded by doctors. He described the president's face as already changed, the muscles relaxed, the expression he had known for years already beginning to fade. Welles, a dignified and reserved New Englander not given to public displays of emotion, wrote that he went and sat down and simply wept. He didn't know what else to do. The doctors came and went throughout the night. They monitored Lincoln's breathing, which was irregular but continued. His pulse was weak. There were moments when it seemed like it might stop entirely, and then it would stabilize slightly. The medical men understood there was nothing substantive to be done. They were keeping vigil, not providing treatment. Mary Todd Lincoln was in and out of the room. She couldn't bear to see her husband like that, but she couldn't bear to stay away either. She kept asking if he was going to survive. The doctors chose their words with painful care. Robert Lincoln, the president's eldest son, arrived during the night. He was 21 years old. He had been at a gathering elsewhere in the city when the news reached him. Witnesses described him as composed in the way that young men sometimes are when they're in too much shock to understand yet what they're feeling. He stood at his father's bedside for a long time without speaking. There's a detail from that night that I find particularly affecting. At some point during the long hours at the Petersen House, someone brought chairs into the small room so that people could sit near the bed. The room was not large. It was a simple boarding house bedroom, and it filled quickly with cabinet members, senators, doctors, military officers. People were standing in the corridor outside, waiting for news. And in the middle of all of this, on a too-short bed in a stranger's house, the President of the United States was dying. When you read through the accounts from people who were present that night, not just at the theater, but at the Petersen House, in the streets outside, in the corridors and antechambers, certain things come up again and again. The sounds. Multiple witnesses mentioned the sounds of that night as something they could never get out of their heads. The sound of the shot itself. Again, smaller than expected, lost almost entirely in the laughter of the crowd. The sound of Mary Todd Lincoln screaming. The sounds from the theater as the crowd erupted. And then, later, the sound of Lincoln breathing, a deep, slow, labored breath that witnesses described in terms that are almost impossible to read today. Dr. Leal described it. Gideon Welles described it. Several others described it. The technical medical term for it is Cheney-Stokes respiration, and it's associated with severe brain injury. But to the people in that room who didn't have clinical language to fall back on, it was simply the most terrible sound they had ever heard. The smell. This is something that comes up in several accounts, and it's the kind of detail that you don't invent. The smell of gunpowder in the theater box. Still present when the doctors arrived. The smell of blood. Laura Keene's account mentions the smell quite directly. So does Rathbone's account. It's one of those sensory anchors that lodged in the memory and stayed there. The light. The Petersen House bedroom was lit by candles and a small gas lamp. Several witnesses noted how the light played across Lincoln's face during those long hours. Gideon Welles, in particular, wrote about this. The way Lincoln looked in the candlelight, and how strange it was that the physical reality of the man was still so present, so recognizable, while at the same time already somehow gone. And the quiet. After the initial chaos of the theater, after the screaming and the crowd and the confusion, the Petersen House was described by nearly everyone as strangely quiet. People spoke in low voices or not at all. Cabinet members who had been rivals and political adversaries sat next to each other in silence. There was a sense, multiple witnesses wrote, of something ending. Not just a life, but something larger, an era, a particular version of what the country had been. Lincoln died at 7:22 in the morning on April 15, 1865. He had survived through the night, which is a testament to his remarkable physical constitution, because by any medical reasoning available at the time, he probably should not have. But he made it to the morning. Gideon Welles was present at the moment of death. He described the room as very still. The breathing that had been going all night simply stopped. One of the doctors stepped forward, listened for a heartbeat, straightened up, and shook his head. Edwin Stanton is reported to have said, in the silence that followed, "Now he belongs to the ages." That phrase, "Now he belongs to the ages," is one of the most famous last words in American history. There's been some debate among historians about whether Stanton said ages or angels, and whether the exact quote has been accurately transmitted. But multiple people in that room reported hearing something close to those words, and they have stayed with us ever since. Because they're right, aren't they? Whatever the exact wording was, the sentiment captured something real. Lincoln in death became something different from Lincoln in life. Not a politician, not even quite a human being anymore in the public imagination. A symbol, a martyr, a figure who belonged to a story bigger than any single country or generation. For the people in that room at that moment, though, he was still just a man who had just died. And that's the part that the history books sometimes lose. Mary Todd Lincoln had to be helped from the room. Robert Lincoln was described by several witnesses as finally breaking down, the composure he had maintained through the night giving way all at once. Welles walked out into the street in the early morning light and stood for a moment trying to remember how to breathe normally. The city outside was beginning to wake up, and in the way that news traveled in 1865. Not instantaneously, not through a phone or a screen, but person to person, door to door. The information was spreading outward from the Petersen House through the streets of Washington. The reaction in Washington, D.C. that morning is itself a remarkable chapter in the eyewitness record. People who had gone to bed on the night of April 14th in a city full of celebration woke up on April 15th to a city in mourning. The contrast was almost violent. A newspaper vendor named Isaac Bassett, who worked in the Capitol building, later described the morning of the 15th as one of the strangest experiences of his life. He came to work expecting the continuation of the euphoria that had been building all week. Instead, he found people crying on the steps of the Capitol. Men who he had known for years, steady and professional men, simply standing there weeping without attempting to conceal it. In homes across the city, families who heard the news described similar moments. The disbelief, the need to ask again, "Are you certain? Are you absolutely certain?" Because it had seemed so impossible. Lincoln was not supposed to die now. The war was over. The hard part was done. He was supposed to be there for the reconstruction, the rebuilding, the trying to figure out what came next. And now, he wasn't. Charles Adolphe de Pineton, a French diplomat stationed in Washington, wrote a letter home describing the city on April 15th that is one of the more evocative contemporary accounts. He described a silence in the streets that he found eerie. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a large number of people who had nothing to say. Shops were closing, flags going to half-staff, people moving through the city with a kind of stunned slowness. He wrote that he had lived through difficult days in Paris, through political upheavals and public crises, but that he had never seen anything quite like Washington on that morning. He described it as a city whose face had changed overnight. That image, a city whose face had changed overnight, has stayed with me since I first read that letter. We should spend some more time with Henry Rathbone because his account is uniquely detailed and uniquely painful. Rathbone was in the box. He saw everything at close range. He tried to stop Booth and was seriously wounded for his effort, and in the aftermath, he was consumed by a guilt that, By most accounts, he never fully escaped. He blamed himself for not stopping Booth, for not doing more, for not being faster, stronger, more alert. He had been sitting just feet away from the president when it happened, and he hadn't prevented it. In the immediate aftermath, Rathbone gave a detailed official statement to investigators. He described Booth entering the box, the shot being fired, his attempt to intervene, the knife wound, and Booth's escape. He was precise and clear in this account, even accounting for the trauma he had just experienced. But over the years that followed, Rathbone's mental state deteriorated significantly. He married Clara Harris, his companion that night, in 1867, but the marriage was marked by his increasingly severe psychological difficulties. He was haunted by what he had witnessed, by what he hadn't prevented. In 1883, Rathbone attacked and seriously wounded Clara in Germany, and then attempted to take his own life. Clara did not survive her wounds. Rathbone spent the rest of his life in an asylum in Germany, dying in 1911. His story is not a comfortable footnote. It's a reminder that witnessing a traumatic historical event doesn't end when the event ends. The people who were there carried it with them in ways that reshaped their lives. Clara Harris, in the years between the assassination and her death, was known to appear at social events still wearing the dress she had worn to Ford's Theater that night, the dress stained with Lincoln's blood. Whether this was grief, trauma, a kind of memorial act, or something else entirely, is hard to say from this distance. But witnesses who saw her described it as deeply unsettling and deeply sad. While the city mourned, the investigation was already underway. Stanton had begun organizing the search from the Petersen House itself, and by the morning of April 15th, it was known that John Wilkes Booth was the shooter. The network of people who had been aware of Booth's plan, his co-conspirators, people who had housed him or provided resources, began to unravel. Arrests were made. The investigation moved quickly, partly because Stanton was determined and relentless, and partly because Booth had not been nearly as careful about concealing his movements as he might have believed. Booth himself, with his broken leg, fled into Virginia with an accomplice named David Herold. He had expected to be received as a hero in the South, as the man who had avenged the Confederacy. He was not. The people he encountered during his flight were mostly terrified of the consequences of helping him, and the ones who did provide shelter did so reluctantly. Booth spent 12 days on the run before being cornered at a farm in Virginia on April the 26th. He refused to surrender, and in the ensuing standoff was shot by a soldier named Boston Corbett. He died a few hours later. His last words, reportedly, were a request to have his hands raised so he could look at them. He looked at his hands and said, "Useless, useless," whether that's remorse or something else. The acknowledgement that his grand gesture had accomplished nothing is left to interpretation. The co-conspirators were tried by a military tribunal. 4 were hanged, including Mary Surratt, the first woman to be executed by the federal government of the United States. The legal and moral questions raised by that trial have been debated ever since. Ford's Theater itself became, almost immediately, a place that Washington didn't quite know what to do with. The government purchased the building shortly after the assassination and converted it to office use. Henry Ford, the theater owner, received some compensation but never returned to running a theater there. The building underwent various transformations over the decades. In 1893, the building partially collapsed, killing 22 clerks who were working inside. If that seems like an almost Gothic ending to the story of that building, you're not alone in thinking so. The building was eventually restored to its 1865 appearance and reopened as a museum and working theater in 1968. The centennial period of the assassination. Today, you can walk into Ford's Theater and stand in roughly the spot where any of the witnesses we've discussed were standing on April 14th, 1865. You can look up at the presidential box, still decorated as it was that night. You can walk through the corridors and try to imagine the evening before it changed. A lot of people find it an extraordinarily moving experience. Some find it unsettling. The building holds a weight that isn't easy to shake off. Here's something that rarely gets discussed. Some of the people who were present at Ford's Theatre that night lived remarkably long lives, and because of that, the chain of living memory stretches further than you might expect. Samuel Seymour was a 5-year-old boy attending the theatre with his family on April 14, 1865. He remembered seeing a man fall from the presidential box. At 5 years old, he didn't fully understand what he was witnessing, but he remembered it. He remembered the commotion and the noise and the fear. Samuel Seymour lived until 1956. In that year, at the age of 96, he appeared on a television game show called I've Got a Secret and revealed his secret to the panel. He had been present at Ford's Theatre the night Lincoln was shot. The panelists were visibly stunned. Think about what that means for a moment. There was a living eyewitness to Lincoln's assassination appearing on American television in 1956. The same year Elvis Presley released Heartbreak Hotel. The same year Eisenhower was running for re-election. That is how recently the living memory of April 14, 1865, was still present in the world. The last documented eyewitness to the assassination by most historical accounts was a woman named Freda Heinzen, who died in 1975. She had been a very young child in the theatre that night. Most historians accept that with her death, the last living thread of direct personal memory of that evening was severed. But the written accounts, the sworn testimonies, the letters and diary entries and newspaper interviews, those are still here. And they tell a story that no history textbook can quite capture, because they're not about what happened in the abstract. They're about what it felt like, what it sounded like, what the person standing next to you did, what you couldn't forget no matter how hard you tried. You might be wondering why any of this matters in the present tense. Why spend this much time with events from 160 years ago, told through the accounts of people who have been dead for generations? Here's my answer to that. History, when it's taught as a sequence of dates and events and outcomes, tends to feel inevitable. Lincoln was assassinated. The war ended. Reconstruction began, and then failed. These things happened, and we learn them as facts, and they feel fixed and distant. Things that were always going to happen, unfolding according to some script. But when you read the eyewitness accounts, when you sit with the actual words of the people who were there, the sense of inevitability evaporates entirely. What you're left with is a series of moments that could have gone differently at any point. What if Grant had kept his engagement and attended the theatre? What if the guard outside the box had stayed at his post? What if Henry Rathbone had been a few feet closer? What if Booth had missed? These aren't idle what-if games. They're reminders that history is made by human beings in real time, in the dark, under conditions of uncertainty, making the best decisions they can with the information they have. And sometimes the decisions, or the failures to make them, change everything. The people in Ford's Theatre on April 14, 1865, didn't know they were in a history-defining moment. They thought they were at a play. They were laughing at a comedy. They were enjoying a Friday evening at the end of a terrible, long war. And then, in the space of a single second, they weren't. That gap, between the ordinary and the catastrophic, between the before and the after, is something that every generation discovers for itself. The witnesses from Ford's Theatre are not so different in the end from people who found themselves present at other hinge points in history, suddenly aware that the world had just fundamentally changed and would never be the same again. That's the thing about being a witness to history. You don't get to choose when it happens or whether you're ready for it. It just arrives, in the middle of a Friday night at the theatre, or wherever you happen to be, and then you spend the rest of your life trying to describe it to people who weren't there. Let's bring it back to the most basic level. The human level. Abraham Lincoln was 56 years old when he was shot. He had been president through the 4 bloodiest years in American history, during which approximately 620,000 soldiers died. And those are the military deaths alone. The civilian toll, the economic devastation, the psychological damage to an entire generation, these are incalculable. Lincoln had carried that weight, and he had made it through. The war was over. He was 56 years old, and the war was finally over, and he was sitting in a rocking chair at the theater on a Friday night, holding his wife's hand. And that's where the story ends for him. For the witnesses, the story continued. Rathbone and his tortured guilt, Mary Todd Lincoln, who spent years in grief so profound that her own son eventually had her committed to an asylum for a time. Dr. Leal, who went on to have a long medical career, but who said in an interview late in his life that he thought about April 14th, 1865, virtually every single day. The witnesses carried the night with them. They carried the sound of that shot and the screaming and the labored breathing in the candlelit room. They carried the image of a man they had seen alive and laughing just minutes before. They carried the weight of having been there, of having been close enough to touch history and being unable to change it. And now, in a way, we carry it too. Because that's what the written record does. It transfers the weight of experience across time, from people who lived it to people who read about it a century and a half later, and find, to their surprise, that it still lands with force. So that's the story of the night of April 14th, 1865, told as much as possible through the people who were actually there. James Ferguson in the dress circle, Dr. Leal climbing into the box, Laura Keene holding Lincoln's head in her lap, Gideon Wells sitting down and weeping because he didn't know what else to do, Edwin Stanton at the bedside at 7:22 in the morning, and little Samuel Seymour, 5 years old, who saw a man fall from a box and didn't understand what it meant until much later, and who lived long enough to tell a television audience about it 91 years after the fact. History isn't made up of dates and outcomes. It's made up of human beings in specific moments, doing what they can with what they have, and then living the rest of their lives with what they witnessed. That's true for the people in Ford's theater, and it's true for people in every generation who find themselves unexpectedly present when the world changes. If you found this video worthwhile, please consider subscribing to the channel. We do deep dives into historical events exactly like this one, using primary sources and eyewitness accounts to try to put you as close to the actual experience as possible. We have videos on other pivotal moments in American history that follow the same approach, and there are links in the description if you want to keep going. And if you have thoughts on this particular story, moments that struck you, details you'd never heard before, things you want to know more about, drop them in the comments. I read everything. Thank you for watching.